Hi, gang. Donna here. Today I am with author Susan Cushman. She's a fictional author and a grandmother who resides in Memphis, Tennessee. She will be releasing her seventh book on June 8th entitled John and Mary Margret. While Susan and I will be exploring her writing career, we will also be exploring her Better Two story, and that was about adopting three children and the life journey it took her on, as well as the inspiration for her books. So, hello, Susan. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Donna, thanks so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about what happened. You decided at what age that you wanted to be a mom and adopt?
Well, I think I always wanted to be a mom. And I actually found out really young that I wasn't going to be able to have biological children. I got married really young. I was barely 19. We just celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary last
Oh,
summer. Thank
congratulations.
you. So early on, my husband and I wanted to adopt. In fact, it took us 7 years to adopt our first child because we were 19 and 21 when we got married, and immediately went running to the adoption agency to apply. And they looked at us like we were crazy. You know, we're not going to give a baby to 19 and 21-year-old newlyweds. You know, come back in 3 years. We require that you've been married 3 years.
But isn't that kind of funny because, you can get pregnant and
Exactly.
there you go.
But they had,
Yeah.
they could be picky. They had lines of people wanting to adopt, So my husband was starting medical school. So maybe they said, come back in 4 years. Anyway, he finished medical school and we went back and applied, and they said, now we want to wait 3 more years until residency is over and you have this established income. Of course, all of our friends were having kids.
Yeah.
Plus, financially, we were going to be fine eventually, and babies didn't need their parents to be wealthy,
Right.
So they made us wait 7 years.
Wow.
So after we've been married 7 years, we adopted our first son, Jonathan, and he was a newborn. He was 2 weeks old, and he was white, and he was from Mississippi. And, so there we started our family that way. But we thought, well, this took 7 years. Let's not wait long to apply for a sibling, And so the same agency told us, we're not going to allow you to adopt more than one, because we have such a long waiting list.
Oh, okay.
And these are the same social worker who talked about the importance of adopted children having siblings. I'm like, so where are we going to get siblings? And so we saw a newspaper. Oops. We saw a newspaper article. That was my Alexa telling me something. A newspaper article about couples who were adopting children from South Korea.
Okay.
Through Holt International Agency, and they were having a meeting, and we lived in Jackson, Mississippi at the time. I'm in Memphis now. Mm-hmm. So we went to this picnic where all these families were who had adopted children from South Korea, and we instantly knew that's what we wanted to do. So Jonathan was close to 3. No, he was 4 or 5 years old by then, 5. So instead of asking for a baby, we decided to ask for a toddler, about a 3-year-old, so he wouldn't be too far distance from his brother. So we adopted Jason from South Korea, and then about a year later, we adopted Beth, also from South Korea, though they are not biologically related. So so we had the 3 of them in 1985.
My sister-in-law adopted 2 children from China, so I'm aware of that whole process and the ordeals. So
right. Well, it definitely changes your life, in wonderful ways, in really good ways.
So you have the 3 children now, and how's life going now that you're a mom of 3?
Yeah, well, they're grown.
Well, I understand they're grown now, but I'm saying back then.
Yeah.
How did it go?
It was great. They all, just like all kids do, they had their baggage, they had their issues, they had their things to go through. And Jonathan, the oldest, is turning 43 and just now about to get married. Jason turned 40 today, and he has 2 daughters, and Beth is 38, turning 39. She has 2 daughters, but at a certain point, you don't even think about the fact that they're adopted. You're just raising your kids. You're just doing the best you can, and you're loving the things they're good at. that maybe weren't even things you or your husband were good at. And that's kind of fun to watch. I mean, they're genetically not getting our traits. So they have their own packages, their own wonderful talents and gifts and stuff. So that was fun. That was fun. Still is fun to watch that. The last one left home 20 years ago.
Wow.
So we've been empty nesters for 20 years. And by this November, all three will be married. And like I said, we have 4 granddaughters. So yeah, it has been and is a wonderful experience.
Oh, I can imagine. I can imagine. I was a stepmom, so that's how I had my children. And yeah, I mean, when they're with you, you love them like they're your own. There's no choice. There's no line that says, well, they're not my biological kids, because if something happens to them, you want to make sure they're okay. If you want to hold them while they're crying, you want to be there. You want to be their parent. So adoption and being a step parent they have similar things.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but that's true. Yeah.
But here's the funny thing is people look at adoption as, oh, well, they're your kids. Step parent,
Well, I have not thought about that.
Yeah. So how did the adoption process end up inspiring your latest book?
Well, it was like a generation later. Well, okay, let me back up. Our daughter's husband is Black. Okay. So, and our son, Jason, who's from South Korea, his wife is Hmong. So Jason and his wife, their 2 daughters are Asian, but mixed Asian, Hmong and Korean. And then Beth and her husband's 2 daughters are mixed Black Korean. So, we do have these many mixtures in our family. It's just beautiful. But I think, a year ago, especially when George Floyd and all of the protests started happening more and more and more, I had a bit of an awakening. I never thought of myself as racist. What racist person adopts Asian kids and loves to death her Black son-in-law, and yet I grew up in that white privileged bubble in Jackson, Mississippi in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s. And even when I was at Ole Miss, I was unaware of what was going on there in the late 60s that I write about in my book. So I don't know when you want to segue into.
Oh no, you can go ahead. I mean, if this is going to all tie it in.
Yeah, my new novel, John and Mary Margret, which comes out June 8th, as you can see, it's about a Black boy and a white girl who fall in love on the Ole Miss campus in 1966. And so Mary Margret, the girl in it, has a lot of similarities to me because she's from my hometown of Jackson, Mississippi, and she wants to be a writer. And she actually gets to know Eudora Welty because she lives in her neighborhood, which I lived in, but I didn't get to know Eudora Welty. So I lived vicariously through that. And all her mother wanted was for her to pledge Tri-Delt at Ole Miss, which I had done, which she does, and get a degree in education so she can teach school someday and marry a lawyer or a doctor and, be part of the country club set. That's all her mother wanted for her. And so, when she tries to date this Black boy in 1966, it did not go well. I'm not going to go into what all happened to them because you have to read the book, but it did not go well, and so I had actually written a short story about John and Mary Margret 2 years earlier in my short story collection, Friends of the Library, which is stories that are set in 10 small towns in Mississippi. And one of them is John and Mary Margret's story. And more than one reader reached out to me and said, why don't you turn that story into a novel? Because it's got a lot more meat in it than just a short story. And so when I decided to write this book last May, just about a year ago, we were just a month or 2 into the pandemic. Mm-hmm. I was coming out of my 2-month funk of eating junk food and watching TV and being depressed, like a lot of us were doing. And my husband said to me, I don't get your funk. You're a writer. I mean, all you need is quiet time alone to write. You'd be begging for that if you could get out there and be busy doing things. And I said, you're right. And then I was also talking to him about the protests that were going on, because in Memphis, I really wanted to go and join some of the protests. And thankfully, they were not violent. But I'm 70 years old and it was COVID.
Yeah.
2 reasons for me to not to be out in the streets of downtown Memphis. Oh, hey, Cat. I love
That's Chloe.
Hey, Chloe. I love cats. So, you know, my way to protest, my way to speak up would be to write. But I wasn't going to write nonfiction. I wasn't going to write journalistic or that kind of writing. It was going to be fiction. And I thought then John and Mary Margret's story would be perfect for right now, for while all this is going on. And this is not going away anytime soon.
No.
It didn't just arrive, and it's not going away soon. So I did a lot of research on especially civil rights issues in Oxford, Mississippi, where Ole Miss is, and in Memphis, where I am now. The story is set in both of those cities, and Jackson, Mississippi, over a 50-year period of time. So in the back of the book, in the author's notes, I have a lot of resources, you know, that I identified there, because I did a ton of research to make sure I got the historical part right.
Mm-hmm.
But the romance between John and Mary Margret, which actually ends up spanning 50 years, you know, that part is completely fictional. And I hope that part gives the book hope. You know, I did an interview recently, and the interviewer said he thought the theme of the book was love. And I was thrilled. You know, I thought, yay, you know, it's not anger. You know, I wasn't going to write a book about anger. You know,
I think that's one of the things we lose in all this, that we should be focused more on love than the anger. I mean, there should be, there's a lot of things that we should be angry about,
right.
But love can overcome so much.
Right. Well, I dedicated the book to my granddaughters, and I wrote in the front, you know, I hope that the world treats you with kindness. So that is for
they're gorgeous.
Gabby and Izzy, my daughter's daughters.
Gorgeous.
And this is coming into more awareness too. And for Grace and Anna, my sons.
They're gorgeous too.
Yeah, and you know, with the recent Asian hate episodes that are going on, you know, all of my girls are on my heart and in my prayers all the time. And I adore our son-in-law. And I was telling him on a visit we had with them at Christmas that I feel like I've been having an awakening, you know, this last year. And having these children and these grandchildren certainly enhances that. You know, I don't know if I didn't have them, you know, but you're saying better too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, is it better to have adopted them? Well, of course, I just have no idea what my life would have been like otherwise, you know, but other things, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Other things, of course, contributed to the awakening, including a whole lot of reading. Last summer, I read what I consider to be one of the best books I've ever read, and it's Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And it is a masterclass in race issues in this country and India and Nazi Germany, and the comparisons between those three. And it was a real awakening for me to read that. And the works of Ralph Eubanks, who is a Black Mississippi author, a visiting professor at Ole Miss. And he and another Black author both read an early version of the book and gave me a lot of helpful feedback that I really much needed. It's a little scary for a white woman to write about this. Yeah. You know, though my protagonist, one of them is a white woman, you know, but the Black male side of it, I needed a lot of help with. And the legal side, John in the book wants to be a lawyer. So I had a couple of Memphis lawyers also read it and give me feedback, because several chapters are set in Memphis. And I have some friends who are native Memphis people who gave me feedback on that as well. Because I think it's important, even in fiction, to keep the reader safe, which is a phrase that's used, so that you're not going to go along and go, wait, that wouldn't have happened in Memphis.
That's one of my biggest things, because I consider what I write realistic fiction. I research and try to make sure everything is, because I usually set my stuff back in the 80s and 90s. So I make sure that I go back and look at certain things, even if it's a cell phone, just to make sure it's the proper one.
Or a cocktail. Yeah. You know, in my first novel, Cherry Bomb, one of my early readers caught it. Part of it was set in the 70s and 80s. And there was a scene in New York City at a bar, and someone was drinking a certain cocktail. And she's like, did they make that cocktail by 1980, whatever? I went back to research the cocktail. because it was going to trip her up, whether it was a cosmopolitan or what the drink
Right.
was. You have to be sure it fits in the era.
Well, and like, something as simple as a home pregnancy test. If you go back to mid 1980, it was like a chemical procedure to have a home pregnancy test. There wasn't just a little stick. It was this whole little chemical thing that you had to mix all these chemicals together to see.
Oh,
But
wow.
I didn't. I mean, I was in my teenage 20s right then and there. I didn't have the experience. I was finishing up high school in the 80s when this was going on, so I had to research it.
Yeah.
And, as an author, it's best to do your research, because I had, in my last book, Love is Worth Waiting For, I wrote in there that the person was driving a Volkswagen Cabriolet convertible. And while for some that is redundancy because it's a convertible, not everybody that knows about a Volkswagen Cabriolet knows it's a convertible. But if I tell you, if there's somebody that had one of those, they're going to know right off the bat, and that's going to take them back to that moment of, yeah, I had that car. I wanted that car.
Right.
So I try to put some of those realistic things like you were talking about in your story. You have to.
Right. I love cameo appearances by historic people. In my short story collection, Friends of the Library, I did that in some of the small towns. Like one of the small towns was Pontotoc, Mississippi. Well, guess who's from Pontotoc, Mississippi? Jim Weatherly, who wrote Midnight Train to Georgia.
Okay.
So he makes a cameo appearance in that story, which just makes it more fun, especially people who either know him or know that area, one or the other. So that was fun with Eudora Welty. And of course, there are historic people who are referred to in the book. Of course, there was Medgar Evers and so many people that were involved in the civil rights movement that were in there, so including, of course, Martin Luther King. So I tried to stay true to it. I hope I did. I hope I got more details right than wrong.
So you have one other novel that's Cherry Bomb, correct?
Right.
What made you write Cherry Bomb?
Well, at first I wrote a memoir before Cherry Bomb, and then I decided not to go public with some of the things in the memoir that had happened to me. And so I decided to let a lot of those things in my life inform the novel. And I ended up really liking having it in a novel instead, because then you can just make stuff up and get more colorful. The protagonist, Mare, is a young girl who escapes from a religious cult in the 1970s in Georgia, and throws up graffiti as a cry for help, and ends up with a scholarship to the Savannah College of Art and Design, where she's mentored by Elaine de Kooning, a famous abstract expressionist painter. There's your cameo.
Yeah.
And then she ends up going to an Orthodox monastery to learn about icons, which I know how to paint. And there's a weeping icon, there's a miracle, there's a connection between her and Elaine de Kooning and one of the nuns that gets revealed in the end. So a lot of that was just completely made up. But I'm a convert to the Orthodox Church. I've visited many monasteries. I learned to paint icons. I was part of a cult-like religious group. I was abused by my grandfather when I was young. So some of that fed into it, but it wasn't my story at all. It wasn't like people that think they can take a memoir and just kind of fictionalize it. That doesn't usually work. Memoir is one type of art, and a novel is another type of art. And I think you have to be careful thinking, I'm just going to change the names and nobody will know. They will know, for one thing. Somebody's going to know who you're talking about, But in this, I did little sneaky things like my grandfather's middle name ends up being the name of an abusive foster father of the protagonist, just to throw that in there. That was, nobody but me got that. But that was something cathartic about doing that.
Well, exactly. Sometimes when you're writing and you're giving a character a backstory, some of your backstory seeps in there, and then you have a moment of clarity, like, wait a second, that completely changes everything. There was something I was working on not too long ago, and I thought about something my mother had always said, and I used it as a character thing. I used as this girl's going by what her mom said about her father, which was, I thought your father was my knight in shining armor, riding on his white stallion to rescue me. Turns out he was, excuse my language, a jackass. He was riding a jackass and his armor was tarnished. Well, as I'm writing this, I thought back to something my dad's mom had said, that my mom was trying to get out of the house when they got married, that she was all, and I had always never thought about it. I was like, no, you're full of it. No. Because I'm going by what my mom told me. And then I'm sitting here writing this and I'm like, that statement and what my grandmother said kind of are the same thing. If she thought he was the knight in shining armor to rescue her, it's kind of the same thing. Yeah. So that moment of clarity comes sometimes when you're writing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I don't think that many people understand that it's a whole process when you write. It really is.
It is. And the process is different for everybody, and it depends on what you're writing. You might be writing something that's completely not about you, or you're not really in it. It's about someone else or events that aren't a part of your life. Right. But I would say that almost everything I've written has bits of me in it, and my life in it. And I don't know if that's going to continue. This is my 7th book. I've got some more in mind. So I don't know if that's going to continue or not. It might. My very first book was a memoir, Tangles and Plaques, A Mother and Daughter Face Alzheimer's. And that was about my relationship with my mom and what it was like, long distance caregiving for her, really over a 11 or 12 year period. She was in Jackson, Mississippi, and I was in Memphis. The last 8 years of that, she was in a nursing home, and I was back and forth seeing about her, but not true caregiving, obviously. And I had a blog, and every time I would visit her, I would come back and write a blog post about it. And again, a reader said, why don't you turn this into a book? Mm-hmm. I took 60 of those blog posts that covered 8 years, cleaned them up just a little bit, put it into a book. And that's how my memoir came about, and, I was thinking again about the better to, and I would never think that it's better to have had a mother with Alzheimer's or a grandmother, her mother, but I certainly would not have written the book. Maybe the better to part is that it's helping other people.
It's helping other people, and it also motivated you to write. It also motivated you to get you out there. My first book, My Days with the Dark Muse, happened because my husband was at dialysis, and he would be in dialysis for 5 hours a day, 3 times a week. Yeah. So I would go to Barnes and I would try to kill some time there. And I started writing blog entries I took one of the characters from this book I had been working on for 30 years that I had never done anything with. I took this character out of there because he's like, I got a story. And I'm like, okay. And he's basically a drugged up rock star. And so I started writing these blog posts, and I was having rehab centers liking these posts. And I'm like, wait a second. So if they actually think this is real, why not turn it into a book?
Right.
And so I had a friend or two that worked at Barnes, and they were having a new writer's night because they're getting ready to close that location. She's like, this will be your last opportunity. And I'm like, all right, let me finish it. It gave me the motivation to finish it. So you have to look at whatever's presented, even if it's a tragedy, something that's born in a positive way, even though you went through that. And yes, now you're helping somebody because they can pick up that book and learn from your experience. But you also grew, not only as a writer, but you gained something from it, because you can look back and you said, I did this. I helped my mom. I helped write this book that's going to help others. So you have to look at all the positives of it.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad I did it for all those reasons that you just said. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's when we get lost in tragedy. A lot of times we don't look at the positive. We just look at, oh my gosh, this is what we're going through. We don't look at the healing process.
Right.
So go ahead.
Now, my mom died in 2016 and the book came out the next year. So she had not known who I was for about 4 or 5 years. So, I couldn't share it with her.
Yeah.
We had a difficult relationship. I say in the front of the book, the tangles and plaques are not only in your brain, but often in your relationships. And she became sweeter to me rather than meaner. Mm-hmm. And I was able to forgive her and to really enjoy some of my visits with her and to be able to be the daughter she needed me to be during those years without bitterness. So, and even writing the blog post helped me because it kept me accountable. for all those 8 years that I was doing that. That was the writing. Putting it together into the book was the easy part, after the 8 years was done.
But then, okay, what you said right there, though, if you back up for a little bit, the better two thing is the fact that you gained this relationship with your mom that was not very much a relationship prior to this.
Right.
So that in itself is a gift.
It was, definitely was.
I mean, because how many of us don't have that relationship with our parental figure, whether it be mother, father, and we never get that chance.
It's
We
true.
never get that shot.
It's true.
So, I mean, my mom, she died when I was 23, 24.
Oh, wow.
It was her choice.
Mm-hmm.
But why I'm saying this is when it came time for my grandmother, her mom wasn't doing well, it became my responsibility. And there was a lot of resentment because this was supposed to be her job doing this. I love my grandmother. My grandmother was like a mom in a lot of ways. But in a way, it kind of bothered me because it's like, this should have been her place.
Right.
And my dad did the same thing, even though my dad is alive and well. My dad's like, oh, can you come down here to take your grandmother here to go check out these facilities? So you're going to fly me. You're there, but you can't be bothered.
Right.
So you have to look at gaining something from your parents to be able to make amends. And that's a great thing that you could make amends.
I was very thankful for that. Yeah.
So has your, I see that you write, you have the 2 novels, you have a memoir, and you have several, 2 or 3 books of short stories. Is that correct?
No, those are anthologies of essays by other authors that I edited.
Okay.
Really fun projects, a lot easier than writing a book.
Yeah.
If you know the people, one thing I love to do in life, not just in writing, is find people that are good at things and connect them, or find people who would work together good on something and connect it and organize it. So that's what I did with each of these anthologies. I started with a second blooming, becoming the women we're meant to be. Mm-hmm. And I had a neighbor who was in her 80s who got her PhD in aging when she was 65. Oh, she's now written 5 books between 65 and 85. And she's been an inspiration to me. And at her kitchen table one morning, the idea was born for this anthology. And I invited 20 women authors to contribute essays on a second blooming. Some of them are about a second marriage, a second religious experience, a second chance after one was imprisoned or after getting sober or after, something mm-hmm. bad has happened. They're all second bloomings that happen. So that was published by Mercer University Press and was so much fun that I wanted to do it again. So the very next year, I invited 26 authors, this time 13 men and 13 women, to contribute essays for Southern Writers on Writing, which was published by University Press of Mississippi. And again, they did the work. I grouped them kind of in themes, when they all came in. Some were crafts, about the craft of writing. Some were about race. There were, I think, 4 African-American authors. They were about various aspects of writing. And it was so much fun. And then I was asked to do the last one. I'm part of a huge book club organization called the Pulpwood Queens. Kathy Murphy started it 20 years ago. And there's like 800,000 of these book clubs internationally. And they have a big conference every year. And I've spoken as an author there several times. And so in 2019, they were having their 20th anniversary. And Kathy wanted there to be a celebratory anthology and asked me if I would put it together and edit it. 67 people sent me essays.
Wow.
It was a lot of work.
How many actually made it in?
No, I put them all in. It was they were all either authors who had been selected, whose books had been selected for the Pulpwood Queens Book Club, and or had spoken at their annual meeting. Probably 50 of them were authors, and then more than a dozen were members of the book clubs who go to that, and so it was more of an in-house book, people who are not members of that would enjoy it from the point of view of if certain of their favorite authors were talked about in the essays, or they just love book clubs, in general. So that was my last book published before this one. That was the Pulpwood Queens celebrate 20 years.
Now, do you have stories in all of these anthologies?
No, in fact, none of them are actually stories. They're all essays.
Okay.
And I do have essays in all but one of them. I did not put an essay in a Second Blooming. It was my first time to edit an anthology, and it didn't occur to me. I mean, I wrote the preface, but it didn't occur to me that I could include an essay. So for the next two, I included my own essays in the next two, as well as the ones that were contributed. I love essays as a genre. Before I published books, I published 12, 15 essays in various journals and magazines. I'll probably continue to love to write them, do something with them. Maybe another anthology. I haven't figured out what the connecting thread would be yet for another one. We'll see.
So besides research, what is your process when you're writing? I mean, do you plot everything out, or are you a pantser? What do you do? What is your process like?
I have done it two ways. And this is a really good and fun question because I'm a real control person, control freak person. So when I wrote Cherry Bomb, my first novel, I outlined the entire book, 16 chapters, outlined with a paragraph about each chapter before I wrote word one.
Impressive.
And of course, I strayed from the outline somewhat, but I needed the structure, I felt, and I needed the control, I felt. And it didn't change a whole lot, from the outline. And I had author friends who would say things like, oh, when I write, my characters just take on a life of their own. And I always thought that was kind of crazy. Like, how can that be? I mean, they're not real people. What does that even mean? And then when I started writing these short stories, I decided to try that. I mean, I had visited each of the towns where they were set. I was on a little book tour to friends of the library groups at these libraries in 10 small towns. So, and I created a fictional author named Adele who was going on that tour, and she continues in the novel. And but at each little town, I would come home from the visit, just like visiting my mom in the nursing home. I was gonna write a blog post about each, but then I stopped and I thought, what if? And these are my two new favorite words. What if this happened instead? What if this homeless man came to the Friends of the Library thing and Adele got involved in his life and helped him, which happens in one of the stories. What if this girl who's dying of cancer at St. Jude Hospital gets helped by a weeping icon?
Yeah.
What if Adele helps this woman escape from her violent husband in her domestic abuse situation? And now I forgot where I was going with all of that.
We were talking about pantser, plotster, and
yeah. So with each one, I had the setting, the town I visited. I got the idea about the character, and that's all I had. And then I sat down and wrote. And it was the most fun I've ever had writing. I didn't outline a thing. I didn't know how it was going to end. I didn't really know how the plot was going to go, just a little idea about each one. And those short stories, I would write each short story in just a few days. So I had 10 short stories done in a couple of months. And I thought, wow. Well, of course, short stories are easier to write than novels because the narrative arc is so short.
Right.
And with the novel, you got that sagging middle thing that happens that's annoying, and you just need a lot more to be there to it. So after having that experience, then when I was going to write John and Mary Margret, the novel, I really already had a synopsis. I had a 20-page short story, and it served as a synopsis. And I really wasn't going to stray far from that plot. I just needed to do a lot of research and flesh out each of the parts of it. I changed some things. Obviously, you turn a short story into a novel, you're going to change some things. But I had someone ask me in an interview yesterday what I'm going to do next and which approach I'm going to take, since I've done both approaches. And so I do have a novel in mind, and I'm going to try to let the characters speak in this next one. I'm at least start out that way. And then if it seems too out of control and I can't stand it, then maybe I'll pull back and do some outlining. I don't know, but what have I got to lose? I have the main characters and the setting in mind, and one important element of the plot in mind. And I've actually written 6 or 8 pages just to kind of play with it a little. So I'm just going to kind of keep going and see what happens. Why not?
That's the truest way to write. I mean, plotting, like I've told people before, I have plots. I have pages of plotting. I have pages of outline, and I guarantee you, back to that first book I wrote, I was taking my husband to dialysis, and the main character basically comes to me and says, "Hey, I got a better idea for you." I'm like, "Oh no, no, we're not doing that. I like this idea. Just hear me out." So I was like, so I came home and I wrote, and his ending's in the end of the book, not the one I was originally
Yeah,
going to
I
do.
love it. Yeah.
So, you know, you sometimes, however they come, it guides us in a better way. So,
There
you
you
know,
go.
so I've looked at your short stories. So you have 7 books. Now, is that including the ones you edited?
Yes, I have
Okay.
4 books I wrote and 3 I edited.
Okay.
Yes,
Because I wanted to make sure, because in your bio it said 7. So
that's
even
right.
I think on Amazon it said 7. So that's why I was like, I
7.
wanted to check.
Thank you.
So I think that your story is going to be very intriguing and very timely. I mean, that's the one thing about what's going on now. It's like in the 80s, it's kind of, at least for me personally, it was kind of like, oh, everything seems to be progressing. We seem to be moving past these things that were in the 60s and whatnot. But the truth was we weren't.
No, we
We
weren't.
just didn't see it.
Right.
So I think hopefully your book finds the right audience and it can be embraced and people can look at the bigger picture of what you're trying to say here about love. You know, I
Yeah,
mean,
I hope so. I mean, that's why I wrote it, and also to help people maybe who need a little more of an awakening, which I'm still in the middle of. I feel like.
mhm,
Um, so it has a lot of different. Doesn't have a real strong agenda. Just has a little bit of one. If it, I don't know, with fiction, you can't have too big of an agenda or you'll ruin it. It has to be.
right.
It has to be art. This is a real love story. I was thinking about the Notebook,
Okay.
the book about the man and his wife, and she has Alzheimer's,
Hmm.
because there's also an element of Alzheimer's in this book. And I'm not going to say what it is. That's a little bit of a spoiler.
Yeah.
But there is an element of that in there too. And so I went back and reread the Notebook when I was writing this because they're an older couple, and it goes back and forth between their young romance in the beginning, and,
Hmm.
and they end up together and all of that. So I think it's full of hope, hope and love. I hope so.
I mean, that's a good thing. If somebody can read a book and feel that way afterwards, that's a wonderful thing. Um, what has been your favorite book to write or story to write? Maybe that's a better way to phrase it.
Hmm. Um, as hard as it was, Cherry Bomb will always be my baby. And the fact that I spent 6 or 7 years on it, and I also had a New York literary agent that I left because she was trying to change it in ways I didn't like. Her editors were trying to make it more hardcore fiction, Girl with a Dragon Tattoo, which is a good book, but it wasn't what I was writing. I was writing Southern literary fiction with a spiritual element to it. And so we couldn't agree with what to do with it. And so I left her, and I left the opportunity probably for a book deal with HarperCollins or somebody bigger instead of with a small independent press. But I was thrilled with the book. The small press I went with, the editor was great, got what I was doing. I'm proud of the outcome. So that mattered more to me, than making the money or getting the bigger book deal. So I think, and Cherry Bomb has so much of my life in it that I think it will probably always be my favorite.
Hmm.
I kind of think John and Mary Margaret may be my best as far as the writing goes. And it's good to feel that way about your most recent book.
Oh yeah.
I have an artist friend who says, she looks at paintings from the past and she looks at her recent work. And if you can't say, oh, this is so much better, then you're not growing.
Right.
So
Right.
hopefully this is my best writing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I look at my writing from 30 years ago and I cringe. But that's a big thing about having a book deal is you have to be willing to give up. I have a friend who has a series that she didn't get a big book deal, but she went with it. She got a deal,
Yeah.
and they made her change some of the stuff in her books. And my second book that I wrote, the most recent one, Love is Worth Waiting For, I originally wrote that for a contest for a big publisher. The only requirement was a happily ever after. And when I looked at the contract, the submission contract, there was a line in there, and I know it most likely it's standard copy, but I didn't feel right. The line was something along the lines of, well, if we happen to write a book or publish a book that is very similar to yours, you're SOL. So I basically said at that moment, I mean, I spent the time, I wrote the book, I was excited, and I made the choice. I'm like, I can't do this. So I pulled it, and I went back and added a couple of things to it, and I kept the book. I even asked a friend who is signed. She's signed with Llewellyn, and I'm like, is this in your contract? She's like, no. I'm like, I'm not doing this. And I mean, I could have shot myself in the foot, just like you were saying. It's like, but my gut was telling me, because how do you know that they're not going to take that and go, okay, well, thank you for the story. We're going to change some things and it'll be ours. So
I had a good experience with Koelher Books, who published John and Mary Margaret and also Friends of the Library. And the reason I went back to them for John and Mary Margaret, well, they had published Friends of the Library, and since I was expanding one of its stories into a book, I felt like they deserved first opportunity, to publish it. But also because editorially they were great to work with, and yeah, I had the book deal before the editing work happened, but there were very few things that the editor wanted to change that I couldn't live with. And if I felt strongly, he let me go with it. He went with what my strong feelings were. And that's wonderful for an author. He just made it a better book.
Yeah.
And that editor should do.
Yeah, exactly. That's what your editor is there for, is to help you have a better book, not completely change it or take something away from it. Right. They should be able to make it a better book. How do reviews play for you? Do you read your reviews, or do they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and because I've only published with small or academic presses, I don't get the number of reviews that you get if you're published by a bigger house. But even on Amazon and Goodreads, I get almost always positive, and every now and then I get a negative one that's usually humorous. Like for Friends of the Library, the funniest one, I had almost all 5-star, a few 4-star. Then there was this one little 2-star review, and I went, what? And here's what it said. The first words were, I don't like short stories. And I thought, it says on the front of the book, short stories. Why did you buy the book? Why did you read the book if you don't like? It's fun. I don't particularly like sci-fi. I'm not going to go buy a sci-fi book and go on Amazon and give it 2 stars and say, I don't like sci-fi. So, that didn't bother me a bit. And it also doesn't bother me to not have all 5-star, because it looks like they're all bought and paid for.
Right.
As long as I've got a 4-point something up there, then that's good. And on Goodreads right now, I've got, I think, 12 reviews of people who've had arcs, because it's not out yet. And once again, there's 1 3-star with no review. And then all the ones with reviews are 5-star. And I almost wish that 3-star person had written something.
So you would know.
So I would know to give me the feedback. I'm a person.
I got one like that. I got one just like that recently too. And I'm like, tell me why you're giving me a 3-star. Now, the most amusing one now I've had. So My Days, I re-released it. The first time I released it, somebody gave me a 3-star review, and she wrote, I hate this book. I hate the characters. I can't believe I finished. Well, firstly, I'm like, all right, you finished. Secondly, I made you feel something. You felt hate. So at least I did that. Well, it gets better. So recently, same person took down that review, read the new version of it, still gives me 3 stars, and then gives me a different review, and I'm sitting here going, wait a second. So you read the book the first time, you couldn't believe you didn't finish it, then you picked the new version up of the book, because it had been edited, and you read it again. So
you must not have many books to read. Why bother to read something you didn't like the first time?
I don't know. I was just kind of like, all right. So, but yeah, I mean, that's so far, knock on wood. But going back to Goodreads for a second, there's a scam now that I don't know if you've heard about, but there's authors that have mentioned this, that there are people that are actually going on Goodreads and leaving 1-star reviews, and then sending an email to the author saying, either pay us or we're going to ruin your career.
Oh, wow. That's terrible.
Yeah. So that there, you contact Goodreads and they'll take them down, and then it just keeps going. Yeah. So this has been going on a bit.
I hope it doesn't. That's awful.
No, there's that, and then there's the phishing sites who will take things off of Goodreads. In fact, one book that I'm still working on, they took it and posted that they had a copy of it, so you could download it. And I'm like, it's on my computer. I'm not done with it. How?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's one thing readers don't realize, that there's a lot of scams out there, that either review scams or pirating scams. So hopefully you don't have to deal with that, and you have great success.
Thank you. I'm hopeful. I'm excited about this book and about the timeliness of it coming out. Now, I mean, like you, it's always been timely, like you said, as far as what's going on with racial injustice in our countries since the 1500s, when the first slaves were brought here. It's not been fixed. It hasn't been, and it's just that it's been ignored on and off.
Well, and I mean, I grew up in New Orleans, so I know that southern thing, and it's not all Southern people, and I'm not saying it is. And I was very shocked that when I went to Indianapolis, when my mom passed away in 1991, we were driving through between Kentucky and Indiana, and they were advertising a Ku Klux Klan rally on the radio. And I'm like, I grew up in the Deep South. New Orleans is pretty Deep South, but wow. I had never heard anything like this.
Yeah.
And I was mortified. I'm like, why?
Well, just a couple of nights ago on 60 Minutes, there was a special about the Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I think it was called Greenwood, the town, 1920s or so. And it was
1921.
Full of successful Black business people and doctors and lawyers. And it was a fabulous community. They called it the Black Wall Street. Some people did. And tons of it was blown up and burned and torn down, and thousands were homeless, and it never recovered. And, so on the 60 Minutes show, they interviewed a bunch of people afterwards who had never heard, people from Tulsa who never knew about it, who were never taught about it in school, who grew up going to school in Tulsa. These are people now in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and they weren't taught it. I mean, It was huge. I'd never heard of it, but I'm not from Tulsa. But still, wow.
I saw a clip for that I was watching something online yesterday, and they talked about that the History Channel is going to do a whole documentary for it.
Oh, good. I didn't know that. This was just a short piece on 60 Minutes.
Yeah, they're doing a whole documentary on it. And the fact is, there are things that we didn't know. Like, I have a friend who's African American, and she was telling us, we were talking about Juneteenth a few years ago, and she's like, well, yeah, we didn't do the national anthem every morning. We had our own song, and I can't think of the life of me what it is. But I remember looking it up, and there is a different song that they would sing every morning. And, it was a totally different experience for her growing up in Chicago versus where I grew up.
Yeah. Chicago, and see, that's where the Great Migration happened. And I've not yet read Isabel Wilkerson's book about that, which was a decade before she wrote Caste, but it's on my bookshelf to also read it. There's just a lot to learn.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, growing up in Louisiana, I'm sure our history was sanitized. I'm very sure it was, because, that's the way it was. We don't want you to learn things that you're not supposed to learn. And I've been very vocal that my mom, I look at my high school, my junior, senior year in high school, we had moved up to Shreveport, and the area where we lived in, it was a normal middle-class community. The high school, however, my mom said, you're not going to. And I'm like, why not? Well, it's a bad school. Okay, so we're going to get you a fake address. So I had a fake address. Now, I know this has happened before, and somebody ended up in jail for this. But I think the statutes run, hopefully. Otherwise, I'm going to lose my high school diploma. But so I went to a different school out of district because I had a fake address. And prior to that, I was in a private school. So my mom sends me to this school for the fake address, and I'm like, well, why can't I go to the school? I mean, I work at the McDonald's there. Why can't I go to that school? Because it's a bad school. Well, as an adult looking back, I know why it was a bad school. In her mind, her little girl might have been a black man.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Really?
Yeah. What years was that?
That was 1983 to 85.
See, I was in high school in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And at my high school in Jackson, Mississippi, I graduated in 69. The very next year is when busing happened.
Okay.
And so my 3 years in a high school of 1,200, there were no more than 50 blacks total in all three classes. There were just a few. But the next year is when busing happened, and they drew lines all over the city and sent teachers and students here and there and here and there. And I had gone off to Ole Miss then, so I missed that experience. But what instantly happened, I mean, so quick, was all the private schools popped up, because the white parents weren't going to do that. They,
My mom sent me to private. I went to a Catholic kindergarten. I went to a private school that had pre-kindergarten through 8th grade, and we had 50 kids in the whole school. So classes were really kind of combined. It was a cool school. And then I went to another private school, and then a Lutheran school, then 2 years at a Catholic girl high school, all-girl Catholic high school. And then she's like, well, when we moved to Shreveport, she's like, do you want to go to the Catholic girl high school? And I'm like, no, I want to go to a normal school. And yeah, much to her chagrin, I wanted to go to public school. I didn't want to go and be one of the other people. Granted, I admit, most likely life would have been easier had I chose that, because getting acclimated to boys and everything after 2 years of not having that, it was just kind of like, I have to make sure I look good. What? So yeah.
That would be an experience. I never went to an all-girls school. So.
It was always amusing because you could tell who the freshmen were because their skirts were down by their knees. And by the time they hit seniors, their skirts were up on their thighs, even though they weren't, back in the day, I had somebody that had gone there in the 60s. The nuns used to walk around with a ruler. Yep. By the time I got there, we had, I think, one nun, and she was crazy. She happened to be the teacher. Her class was in my homeroom, and we had homeroom in the morning and homeroom in the afternoon. And if you came in, even though the bell rang and she was still teaching, she would chase you out. And there was a rumor that, because it was a typing class, that she had thrown a typewriter out of a window at one point. I'm like, not gonna mess with the nun.
There's a story, a crazy nun throwing a typewriter out the window.
Yes. Now you talk about fun things though about the all-girl school is we had all these open breezeways and we were on a college schedule, so there was a lot of changes going on. But we used to have male streakers run through.
Oh gosh.
I was always in class, but you could always tell because we had no air conditioning in the building. It was all open windows, so you would hear just this loud scream from a bunch of different girls, and you're like, okay, we know what happened. I always missed it, but yeah. So yeah, that's way off topic, but I mean, there's food for your thought if you want to write a story about a crazy nun.
And the male streakers in the Catholic girls' school.
Yeah. I mean, it's things you would not expect, but isn't that the life of a writer? Right. To look at something and be able to totally change it into a different story.
To think, what if?
Yeah.
That's my new thing. I'm thinking, what if?
Right. Mm-hmm. So I have to ask, and I already know the answer. So was it better to adopt and go on this journey?
Absolutely. Because I did learn at a young age that I couldn't have my own biological children, I won't lie and say that there was no heartache there. There was a lot of heartache there, And adopting children doesn't replace biological children. No. That's not the point. The point is you want a family. You want people to love and nurture and to be part of your family, your community. And if adoption was the way that we could do that, that was the way we did it, and gosh, I'm still learning. I've learned so much. And of course, now my adoptive children have their birth children. I'll never forget when Jason, my middle child, when his first child was born, and he was in Denver at the time, and I flew out there. And when he put her in my arms, tears streaming down his face. He said, "Look, Mom, I have a birth family now." And it was not about
Nice.
me. None of my
Yeah.
kids ever rejected me as a mother, or "you're not my real mother,"
Yeah.
or any of that. And I would totally understand and support their search if they wanted to search for a birth mother, which one of the three did unsuccessfully, but I love the joy of seeing them. And I think it's very healing for them because they suffered a lot, by being rejected by their birth
Yeah.
parents. But then for them to have their own birth family is very healing and just brings me great joy. It's just my favorite thing.
Well, and I think however you make your family, whether it be with biological family, adopted family, friends, I think we all discover we have a different family as we get older, as we move into adulthood and even getting older. We find a different family, we find a different tribe, and that's going back to something we were talking about earlier. It's all about love. It's about companionship and compassion. So I applaud you for doing that. I applaud you for the inspiration that you took from it to write your book. Like I said, I wish you much success on the book. Hopefully you find a good audience, and it's a timely topic. It really is.
Thankfully, and it's available for pre-order. But it's available at bookstores anywhere. John and Mary Margaret, independent bookstores are my favorite, and you can also get it online. So I hope people will read it and really grow from it and be inspired by it.
Well, I will have all your links: your Facebook link, your Twitter link, your LinkedIn link, your Amazon link. All of that will be on the bottom of the podcast. Sign in. And then this will be on YouTube the following Sunday, so they can see your beautiful grandchildren and the book cover. So I appreciate you taking the time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks. It was great to meet you. You have a good day.